you know James and half of you don't. But I want to welcome, are we on record?
Yes.
Yes, I want to welcome Ren and Chelsea, who worked with James as his faculty, because they'll be on here on the video. So James is getting his master's degree in humanities, focusing on literature. He actually came to Preston College with your undergrad in English, but also with an MFA, right?
Yep.
MFA in creative writing. So his focus has been on various kinds of contemporary literature, looking at media, looking at magical realism, looking at graphic novels, and so his presentation today, his presentation today is looking at how literature is changing and women's relationship in that, and right, and your practicum on working as an editor for a journal, literature. So welcome.
Yes, this is Beyond Manuscript, and I am Gapinski. Thank you. And I did my practicum at working as an editor at a literary journal called the Coney Review. These are our last 4 issues, which I also have up here. You can page them later, but I learned people get distracted and pass them around. In addition to these 4 issues, we've got the one that was created through the practicum. Hit the next slide. Thank you. Which is volume 3, which I don't have the hard copy of right now because I just have kind of the proof version, and actually placed the big order for kind of the big print run of it yesterday. So that comes out on the 30th. And that's the cover image. I worked with Chelsea Werner-Jatzky, who's the editorial director of the journal. She also edits for Pacifica, and mentored by Ren Powell, who's a writer, and then as well she has an editorial background. She's edited for Pomelium. But I've served as the managing editor of the Coney Review pretty much since its inception in 2011. Next slide, please. Thank you. But this semester, this year, and specifically this semester, has been very different for the journal, and that's kind of why I wanted to build a practicum around it. For just a little context, kind of the what's new and sort of why now, why were we kind of making these changes. The journal grew pretty fast. You know, we have these actually nice kind of printed volumes now, but it's the very first thing we ever produced in 2011 was a little tiny sail stitched, basically chapbook. Just some pages kind of with a long arc stapler. It was kind of a sampler that we used to generate interest, get a little bit of funding, show to bookstores, and kind of get the ball rolling. And from there, it's taken off a lot, and it's actually grown a little too fast to keep up for. We've had to bring on new editors throughout the way. Also produced a couple chapbooks along the way, and didn't have a lot of time to kind of hit the pause button, stop and think, okay, we're growing, we're getting more readers, are we growing in the right direction, are we doing the things we really want to do? Is this a journal we can be super proud of? And I am proud of it, and I have been proud of it, but we also can learn from mistakes of the past and kind of move forward. So this semester was kind of that pause button. I really was excited to build a practicum around it and kind of reshape this a little bit. And so the things that are new, we refocused the journal as a publisher just of innovative fiction rather than the generalist publication that it was before with poetry and other forms included. We kind of found a niche. We redesigned the website, began digital publishing, which I've never done before, that was brand new. Released a handcrafted collector's edition that's coming out on the 30th as well. It's a little box set that's kind of made out of wood and has little nice broadsides inside of it, and it's this really cool printed object. Expand brick and mortar bookstore distribution, and then what I'm going to be talking about today is this reach out to marginalized authors. This was not the entire practicum, and in addition to these new initiatives, a lot of my practicum did involve reading submissions. We had hundreds to pour through, as well as kind of talking with staff and actually working on and doing the layout and getting the book ready. So there was a lot going on. This is not the whole practicum, but this is kind of what I wanted to focus on today because it aligns a lot with the Preston College mission of social justice and human rights, and also there's a good amount of data. We did some outreach to other communities as well, but I really want to focus on women writers because, next slide please, because we do have this great wealth of kind of information of what's going on in this area already through the VITA organization. They were founded in 2009. They began their annual count in 2010, so we've got now 3 years worth of statistics. And what they do is they track gender parity in literary journals. They don't obviously track all the thousands of journals out there, but they hit the biggest, most visible ones that are kind of staples in the literary community, the New Yorker, the Atlantic, those sorts of publications. And they look at how many men are being published versus how many women are being published in these journals, and they're actually kind of tracking that. The statistics continually show this rampant disparity in gender. And the County in Review is no exception. Next slide. So just a little background on some of the numbers. The New Yorker, which even if you don't read lit mags, you've probably heard of the New Yorker or at least paged through it. They're huge, and they are predominantly men in their pages. That's kind of the voice they're projecting. With 69% of the stories published by men, women. Next slide. And the Atlantic, 68%, 32%. Next, please. The New Republic is one of the worst offenders. They're another one of the big ones, and they have a really egregious ratio with 79% of their pages, or their stories, not page count specifically, stories, and authors being men, 21% women. And as I said, we are no exception. Next slide, please. With our last two issues, so from 2013, these two. The first issue of the year, 76% of this one is from male authors and 6% is women. And then we had a little uptick with this second issue of the year, the fall issue. We had 9 women in it for 33% versus 66% men, but that's still a really, really bad ratio. And when you add them both together, next slide, please. We get the same 71-29 that the Atlantic has, one of the bottom rung on the Vita count, and we're kind of right there with them. So I knew this was definitely, as we're kind of reflecting on the first few years of the journal and moving forward, this was definitely something we needed to work on very, very hard. Next slide. So the first thing we needed to do in order to find out, or in order to kind of correct this discrepancy, is find out why it's happening in the first place. And obviously some of that involved talking with our editors and trying to suss out issues of internal bias and the way we read and our kind of our editorial process behind the scenes. But one thing that jumped out at me immediately, and that I've actually been thinking about for a while before this practicum, is this this initial issue that before we even decide who goes in here, before we make those final decisions, the raw submission queue, the number of people saying, hey, here's my manuscript, do you want to publish it? We're mainly seeing stuff from men, even on that back end, before we accept or reject. We're just getting tons from men. So we have this kind of fundamental problem just with the numbers even starting out of the gate. So even if we're trying to get rid of bias and we're trying to read equally, if we're still just being flooded with tons of manuscripts from men, out the back end, we're probably still going to see some discrepancies. So we had to kind of start at that basic level of not only working internally and thinking about bias, but also doing outreach to different communities and encouraging more people to submit who are women, minorities, and LGBTQ authors.
Can I clarify? So that percentage, is that that's just your journal, or is that?
That's mine. I mean, a lot of the Vita count, what they do is they look at publications. They don't, talk to the New Yorker and ask them what and they probably wouldn't release those numbers anyways. But yes, it's just mine. But I've gotten some anecdotal evidence from some other small and mid-tier journals that they're experiencing similar issues. So I don't want to generalize and say that this is the cause everywhere. For us, that's definitely an issue. And for some other editors that I've been talking about through the practicum at other journals, they're noticing very, very similar things. And so on kind of a big picture level, as we're exploring this issue of why, one thing that kept coming up was this issue of kind of this cycle that's hard to break. And Mary Breeden, the founder of the PDXX Women's Writers Collective, she put it really briefly and eloquently to me in an email when we were talking about this. She said, people tend to be attracted to groups and outlets where they can see themselves to be represented. It's pretty much that simple. You pick this up and you page through it, and you don't see as much of your worldview in it. You see mainly a kind of phallocentric worldview, you're not as open to submitting here or to the New York or anywhere else. And the literary community in general, women are not seeing themselves as represented. So I don't want to generalize. Again, I don't know for sure if this is across the board throughout the community, but it wouldn't surprise me if a big part of it is kind of women are discouraged from submitting, and the environment in general is just not very inviting. And we have a lot of journals where we've got this kind of self-perpetuating cycle where women don't see themselves, so they're not submitting, and you're getting this thing that's kind of hard to break. And then also, in addition to kind of the community aspect, it's been institutionalized. In academic circles, a lot of the MFA program reading lists skew male. You can find a lot of the reading lists just by Googling the programs. There are some that are doing good work in this area, but a lot of them skew male, and they also skew white male. Juno Diaz recently published a really nice article called MFA versus POC, people of color, where he talked about reading lists. He also talked about the fact that a lot of faculty, even though the student body may be very diverse, a lot of the faculty at Master's of Fine Arts programs tend to be Caucasian, and a lot of the minority writers who are there kind of having this mentor that they look up to and idealize as this is what a good writer is not kind of operating from their same circumstance or their same worldview. And you kind of get this disheartening sort of you're on the outside kind of thing from the very beginning, like as you're kind of entering that academic institution. At my MFA program, it was self-directed, so I was able to get more women on my reading list. It was a low residency program as well. But I still, if I had put it myself on autopilot, when my instructors were just recommending stuff before I started speaking up and kind of working on that, I was handed a lot of David Foster Wallace and Thomas Pynchon and Cormac McCarthy, and these are sort of the staples. And I think that's kind of an embedded problem with the community as a whole. And we get this kind of hostile and uninviting environment where we're starting to see this, at least for us, this discrepancy where women don't feel like our journal at least, and maybe the community as a whole, is a safe space where they can submit work to be published. You're getting kind of this discrepancy right out of the gate sometimes. Next slide, please. And again, whether or not that's widespread or that's just us, you can't rest on your laurels and basically say, well, more men are submitting in the first place, so we'll just publish more men. You have this social responsibility, and Roxane Gay talks about it in her essay Beyond the Measure of Men, first printed in the Rumpus, and then in her book of essays, which are on my reading list, Bad Feminist. She said, if women aren't submitting to your press or publication or press, ask yourself why, deal with the answers even if those answers make you uncomfortable, and then reach out to women writers. You can't just take it as an excuse. It needs to kind of be a call to action to actually be part of the solution. Next slide. So one of the things we did, and this is kind of a big part, there was some other outreach involved, but I really want to focus a bit on submission bombers. We reached out to this group, and we've been kind of partnering with them for a little while throughout the practicum. And they were founded by Laura Davis, the editor of Weave, who is, that's one of the few journals that has an amazing reader count right now. They publish a lot of women. And they're an online group for marginalized authors, not just women, but also LGBTQ and minority writers. I don't have as much data on these groups because it's sort of, I don't want to go and ask all of our authors who submit, like, can you fill out this questionnaire about your gender and race and that sort of thing. So a lot of my focus, kind of in terms of the stats, was on women, but we also wanted, we were glad that they were reaching out to this entire collective of marginalized people. And they schedule bombings of different journals and publishers, bombings as they call them, where they flood the queue with a lot of work from their group. And it's basically this way to say, okay, you claim you want to improve your beat account, you claim you want marginalized authors, all right, prove it, and they send you a bunch of work. And we've been actively working with them, including throughout the practicum. There were 2 scheduled bombings. I've also been in contact with a lot of their members. And they've been a huge, huge part of this practicum in terms of making sure that that back-end submission ratio was closer to 50-50 rather than that skewed number from the get-go. Next slide, please. There was some other organizations, though, that we reached out to, some different women's writing groups in Boston, Denver, and Portland, and the PDXX Collective is one that specifically we're hoping to, in 2015 at the WordSoc conference in Portland, hoping to do some readings or possibly a panel with them where we can talk about some of these issues in a more public kind of forum. Also connecting with representatives from other magazines. Pacifica Minerva Rising features in the Newer York. Next slide. And then in addition to this direct outreach, a lot of the time was spent on what I kind of am calling indirect outreach, which is sort of either behind the scenes stuff or just making sure that as we're walking the walk, we also sort of talk the talk and we speak out and have a good public image so that people, in addition to actually doing this direct outreach, anyone who just stumbles onto us can see that we care about these issues and can see themselves represented in the things we talk about on our social media websites, as well as in our editorial board. We openly were discussing bias, privilege, and prejudice during meetings. It was hard to do that when you have hundreds of submissions to look at. You often make snap decisions, so we picked a few where we kind of just, right from the first line and the title and the author's name and everything, kind of talking about what our presumptions were, and then reading it and kind of just deconstructing some of the editorial bias that might be going on. And out of that process, I got rid of, in the submittable dashboard that we use to manage manuscripts, I got rid of the ability for us editors to even see the biographical data of a submitter, because there's a little bio field. If you've read a Glitter magazine, at the back, everyone gives kind of their little 3-sentence bio. We don't even look at those. We're just sort of looking more at the work itself now. Also, kind of, I've been personally taking up this cause of the Stephen Tully Dirks incident, which occurred kind of halfway through the practicum, which, who this guy is he's an editor who was recently accused of multiple rapes. Kind of younger women authors who kind of looked up to him and thought he could kind of give them connections. And so it's this huge issue that's been that I've been focusing on in terms of discussions of power and privilege, and how, because a lot of people who have been blogging and talking about this issue have been focusing on the alt-lit community, which is kind of where his journal used to be a part of, Pop Serial.
James, can I pause you for 1 second
Sure.
while we do a quick tech support thing? I'm so sorry. I apologize for this.
Have we been recording?
The internet shut down,
We
so
lost
we
the
have
producer.
lost it for
Okay.
a couple minutes, yeah. Okay, and you're recording. Great. You have it up on your side? Okay, go ahead.
Thank you.
Yeah, I'm so
Yeah,
sorry.
thank you. So as I said, the problem is this has been kind of blowing up within certain circles where people have been talking about this, and the issue though has been a lot of demonizing of this specific niche community of the alt-lit scene, whereas we were trying to kind of take a stand and be like, no, this is has to do with kind of the literary world in general. We're not just talking about one little sect of it. There's misogyny kind of everywhere. And the Veto organization, the first part of the essay, kind of prefaced all that sort of discussion in this essay, and it's part of this concept of projecting that stance with the journal that yes, we care about this, rather than having more of a neutral kind of stance in the kind of social media and blogging world, where we were often just sharing craft articles and things about writing, and not as much about other issues that we care about, and making sure we voice these things publicly. revised mission statement to publicly state that we do want more submissions from marginalized authors. And then inviting more female authors to be guest editors and judges I thought was important, because our masthead is, the masthead for a lit journal means the editors, the list of editors. We have more than 50% women on our masthead, and our editorial board is myself and 2 women. We don't have a male-dominated masthead, but the guest editor tends to be somebody who gets more attention, sort of, and we do a little work kind of promoting them, and people kind of see that as the face of us for a while. And that has historically been a man. We want to make sure that the people we're bringing in for guest editing represent a variety of backgrounds and viewpoints. I was kind of aware of this early in the year when we had Manuel Gonzalez, a great Latino writer, kind of in helping us, and now we have Ashley Farmer. Next year we're working with Amelia Gray, who I'm really excited about. Next slide, please. And so throughout this process of kind of thinking about the numbers, thinking about some things we can do to reach out to different groups, as well as things we can do internally, this is sort of what 2014 has looked like. Ignore fall of 2014. All of 2014, we had, throughout the year, 1,337 submissions. As of when I put this presentation together, we're still open for submissions, so we might have a few more right now. And each submission can contain, in our guidelines, you can send up to 3 flash fictions or 2 short stories in a single document. So this number actually, when you consider just the amount of stories we're receiving, it's a little bit higher. And then specifically for the fall, I don't have an exact count like that, down to the exact number, but it's roughly 500 to 600 submissions during the fall and during the practicum when this was all occurring. Out of this number, we only accepted 20 stories. The print publication is finalized, so those numbers are done. We're still considering online work through December 15th. As you'll recall from earlier, this is our first year doing online stuff as well, but we're kind of, that's still open, so these numbers are evolving a little. Next slide. But here's where we're at for right now, which is a big, big improvement. 71% women and 29% men in the print edition, which, as you'll see, is much slimmer than our other ones. Well, page count-wise, it's not that much slimmer because we got rid of poetry, so when you're talking about stories, it gets thick pretty quickly. But with these pieces that made it through our final kind of rigorous process, we're seeing more out the back end, a lot more women, as well as in the online edition, we have 69% to 31%, and I said this number will likely rise by the end of the year. So it might fluctuate a little bit, but that's where we're at. Next slide. And then overall, we're at 70% women and 30% men, whereas last year, between these 2 issues, we were almost the complete inverse of that. Next slide. So we've had some good success in this outreach in the ways we're able to measure, which is primarily through women authors. And then I get the sense through kind of talking with the submission bombers and also kind of looking at the bios of people we accepted that we have increased our publication of minority and LGBTQ authors, but again, there's not kind of the data to back that up. And I want to make sure this momentum keeps going. So kind of looking ahead to make sure we don't regress and go back into this kind of male-centric publication. I'd be okay with some fluctuations. If we ever are at 50-50, I'm fine. I definitely don't ever want to be back in that terrible beta count range where we're a part of the problem rather than the solution. So looking ahead, we're definitely going to continue to work with the submission bombers group and continue to build that bridge. Continue posts on that Behind the Masthead page where I've been discussing the Stephen Tully Dirks incident, and then other editors have been invited, and we're kind of curating the posts now to just talk about what matters to them. It's kind of just get to know your editor a little bit. Some of us will be talking occasionally about writing and craft and publishing, but we'll also be discussing issues that we care about, such as gender representation in publishing, kind of that public face again. Panels at WordStock conference, hopefully they're not open for the proposals yet, so if that works, if they accept it, we definitely want to hopefully team up with the PDXX Women's Writers Collective in Portland and kind of put on a panel there and bring some of these issues in a public forum. Next slide. Also, making sure that as we do public, we're going to be tabling at the AWP conference in Minneapolis next year. We were at AWP last year as well, and when we're doing this, we want to make sure that as we're talking about our publication and inviting authors to do readings during the offsite event, that we're cognizant of making sure we have diversity represented. And then also I'm doing a workshop in Boston at the Grub Street News and Marketplace Conference that discusses the publishing industry in general, and then in specific, part of that workshop is targeted towards an open discussion about gender in publication and looking at the read count and talking about these issues at that conference. Next slide. And then lastly, when we pick authors from our issues to interview, we want to make sure we're not skewing one direction or the other. We're again keeping that keeping in mind that thing that Mary Breeden told me, that people want to see themselves represented. That's going to make a huge impact just in and of itself. And then our next, after we're done working with Ashley Farmer, Amelia Gray is going to be involved with us for our Innovative Short Fiction Contest. And I think, as I said again, it's about kind of making sure we're representing genders equally when bringing in guests as well. I'm really excited to work with her. I can't even really believe she said yes. I don't know if anyone's read her, but these are her books. This one's forthcoming. You can't buy it yet, but it's coming out next year. And she's kind of one of my top sort of favorite authors of all time, so it's kind of exciting. But yeah, that's kind of what we're doing to keep this momentum going and solidify some of these changes and make sure we, again, don't regress. And I'd like to open it up now sort of for questions, but also if anyone is interested in some of the organizations that I mentioned, as well as some other lit journals who are kind of doing work in this area, rather than kill a bunch of trees, you can go to goniumreview.com/Prescott, and I've just got kind of a list of like a dozen or so links, nothing too heavy, but just if you want to click around and explore a little, feel free. So, any questions?
One thing that I noticed when you were looking at last year and this year's publication, it's just flip-flopped, so it's still not equal. Like how, I'm just curious about, like, I totally am supportive of women authors. I think sometimes maybe go overboard and not letting men have a fair voice in trying to make sure. So we just did a flip-flop, it seems like. So I'm just curious how that is seen as, or understand how that's seen as a success and the equality of it.
I guess it's not seen as a success sort of internally in terms of if you're talking equality, if you're talking 50-50. I look at it personally as a success because if you look at the sort of aggregate literary community in general, I think there's still just this overbearing shouting of male voices. So if we're going to add a little bit extra kind of woman perspective to that, I think it helps tip the overall scales a little more. But yeah, I would personally, be a lot more comfortable at around 50-50 and kind of have this nice kind of shared space for both genders. I think that's sort of a function of kind of doing this practicum and kind of doing a lot of work to really make sure we improved our gender ratio, and kind of moving forward, maybe not being as aggressive, or maybe not, instead of scheduling 2 submission bombings each reading period, maybe we'll just ask that group just to kind of submit once and kind of try to readjust. So it's definitely something that's been on my mind. I mean, obviously I'm a male author. I don't want to completely discriminate against men in some kind of reverse kind of shift. So yeah, it's something I'm kind of thinking about, but I'm not too worried just because it's kind of the overall state of the community right now, if that makes sense. Joan, you have a question?
I appreciate your response to that. Thank you. You'd have to publish a lot of women for a long time to get equity. So yeah. The question I have is, well, it's kind of multi-layered, but are you looking at just U.S. writers? So you're not aiming for international writers?
Primarily, we do get some submissions from different authors overseas, primarily Europe.
But in terms
But-
of wanting to up the marginalized,
Yeah,
so
yeah.
what I'm wondering is if you've considered maybe just saying people of color or writers of color as opposed to minorities, because there's some problems with just the term
the term,
minorities.
yeah.
And then I'm wondering, so what do you do next? Like, this is amazing that you were able to see that much of a difference in 1 year of putting in that effort. What do you do to get that word out to other small literary journals? What do you do to have your next piece? What can you do to get LGBTQ and writers of color in there? So yeah, what's the next? Where does it go?
Yeah, I think next step in terms of kind of making sure it's not just insular and bringing it to the broader community is making sure we share these results at conferences and can kind of continue to talk about it in places where other writers are converging. Kind of continuing to talk about it on social media. A lot of this stuff has happened online. A couple of the people I mentioned, I've never met some of them face to face, just because that's sort of where the literary community is now. It's sort of a lot about blogging online and that sort of thing. So I think if we continue to kind of plug into that community, hopefully it'll spread a little bit, if that answers your question.
Yeah, and so is there a conversation in this world? Like, are there lots of literary journals
we're
doing
not,
what you're doing?
We're not by any means a top tier journal. We're like small press, maybe mid-tier at best, like in my dreamland sort of head. But within our little sphere of influence, we've seen more people kind of being interested in this. But then there are, I think, the VITA count, the VITA organization, which started in 2009, first count was 2010. I think they're already like kind of doing a lot in this area. I mean, I think maybe the next big step would be hopefully getting involved with them in some way. They're a little bit kind of out of our wheelhouse right now as kind of a slightly larger organization that has grant funding and that sort of thing. But it'd be really cool, like sort of, again, just kind of dreaming to work with VITA in some capacity, because yeah, there's a lot of editors who are taking notice, even because now we have these stats, and now it's no longer just this anecdotal kind of saying that yeah, you're publishing more, and we have this. You can point to this graph and be like, look at the New Yorker, look what's happening.
I would think if you could turn that, what you've got there, which was a beautifully created presentation, thank you. If you turn that into something you could send to them, that would be pretty impressive to just say, look what we did.
Yeah. Yeah, and there's even on the big sort of picture, I forgot to mention, I showed some of the worst offenders, but there's actually a couple big names that are starting to move on this issue a little bit because VITA has sort of called them out.
And they are.
The ninth letter is, they're about 60-40 right now. Actually more women than men, so they are kind of in that kind of other direction. Ninth letter, there's a few others, but ninth letter is sort of the big one. Weave, Laura Davis, the person who started Submission Bombers, her journal is Weave, and they're a slightly bigger journal, and they publish a lot of them. Other questions? All right. Thank you.